Howdy, folks. Your host, Double J, host of Operation GCD, back here for a Fridaze. However, my co-host, Nick, will not be joining us tonight. In his place, we got Nate, host of Reality Czars podcast. Nate, appreciate you joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, man. This was a lot of fun the last time I was on, and I'm excited to be here.
Nice. Appreciate you here. Yeah, Nick he came down with some sort of flu bug, so hopefully he'll be back next week. But yeah, I enjoyed our last conversations on here, Nate, so definitely looking forward to another. I'm actually just coming back from injured reserve myself. I blew out my jaw a couple weeks ago, but it's doing a lot better now.
Good, man. Yeah, you got a freshly shaved face, too. Didn't you have a big beard the last time I saw you?
Big beard, long hair. Still kept the headband that I used to keep my hair in bed, just for the bit. I had to clean up for some I had to attend some family business, so cleaned up for some of those situations. But anyhow, our guest here tonight, Jonathan Mitchell. Greetings, sir. I appreciate you joining us here for a discussion here on our Friday show. We're obviously going to be discussing here you're the author of the book, the Before Son of Sam, The Submerged History of a Yonkers Cult. Looking forward to discussing some of that there with you, John.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And basically, looking forward to having a kind of a roundtable discussion on the Son of Sam murders. Very interested in hearing some of your take in regards to the kind of the evolution of activities surrounding the Maury Terry investigation and subsequent activities, post that, and basically our current state of affairs surrounding the topics. Yes, as you obviously have a long-term, perspective and viewpoint on the matter.
Yeah. Looking forward to talking about it.
Anything else you want to talk about? By all means, you got the floor there, John. And like I said, appreciate you joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I was trying to find a place to start. Usually when I do these shows, it's we tend to start out with just sort of a sketch for people that are unfamiliar with the case. What was Son of Sam? Who was David Berkowitz? Was there any evidence that he committed all of the shootings, or was there conflicting evidence somewhere? So I could go over that for folks that are unfamiliar with the case.
Sure. Well, Nate sounds like he's got a baseline understanding, so maybe he would start there. That sounds like a good idea.
Okay.
Nate, what's your understanding of the Son of Sam? So I know Jonathan's focused not only on the Son of Sam, but some of the prelude cult activity and the epicenter of activity there in Yonkers, New York.
Sure, man. I have like a very, I just have the outline there. The first thing that caught my mind was the Berkowitz. The first thing that popped in my, because I'm a crazy conspiracy theorist, and I was like Jew. Then
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So his birth mother and his birth father were both Jewish, and I think his adopted family was also Jewish. Which is, I mean, it doesn't really matter, but that was just the first thing that. And then I was also kind of shocked that he was still alive. It was kind of, I just assumed he was dead. And I was kind of
in decent health. From the interviews he gives, appears to be in decent health.
Is he actually giving out interviews? I didn't even know he was doing that.
Yeah, he's been.
We try to get him on the show. What are we doing? So he's an interesting character. I was trying to see if he was born bad. I was trying to see what snapped in him, because he seemed like he grew up a pretty normal life. He was given up for adoption, right? He was adopted by. It seemed like his folks were all right. His mom, his adopted mother, died when he was a teenager, about 14. I think that was probably pretty traumatic. Maybe his dad was kind of a dick. It kind of sounds like a little bit, but nothing that, in my mind, it was also a very brief window, supposedly, that he was doing the killings. It was 1 year. It was July to July. I think it was 74 or 75 to 76,
76 to 77. But yeah, very, very.
That sounds. Those are some good baselines there, Nate. For John to jump in here, maybe he can fill in some of those details.
Yeah, it was just that year-long period, and he claims that he didn't even join the group until 1975. So that's still a pretty brief window there. although there is some evidence that he was at least acquainted with or aware of the cult prior to that. And, he had a friend who also knew the Carr brothers, who figure heavily in the story, and this friend allegedly was still involved in the cult during the Son of Sam years. So Berkowitz may have at least been aware of the cult prior to 1975.
Interesting. So,
Okay.
like, that's a very big turning point, because his exit from the army. So, Nate, you were mentioning his kind of his childhood. He seemed to have a tumultuous childhood, sure, but it seems like whatever went on in dude's life went on during his years in the army, and what kind of his transition, at least mentally speaking, into adulthood. There, he went into the army. I believe it was for 3 years. Correct me if I'm wrong, John. I believe it was 3 years there, from what,
I believe
72
that's
to
right.
75.
Yeah.
And to be quite honest with you, I've asked this question to a lot of folks, and I've never gotten any answer, seen any documents. I question his exit from the army. So he alleged, from many stories, at least letters to some of his friends, he apparently wrote, he lit the NCO club on fire over there in Korea, the army base in Korea he was stationed at. If that's true, he would have got a dishonorable discharge, and he got a dishonorable discharge. Well, he's not getting a security guard license in the state of New York. He's not getting hired by the post office, because a dishonorable discharge has more weight than a federal felony. Like, federal felonies are a better stat. You want to have that, better, more than a dishonorable discharge.
I couldn't find what he did. I was looking briefly, but it just said that he left honorably. He had an honorable discharge, which is kind of interesting. Right. And there's always that weird, like, the folks that are in the military that are acting funny, that do some dumb shit, and they have to kick them out. And they end up having like federal connections and things like that. And I always kind of question, especially during that era with serial killers in general, like, sure. It almost seemed like most of it was an op. Like, most of it was some MK Ultra interesting stuff, which also has cult ties. Some of those satanic cult ties. I think a lot of that is deep state, MK Ultra type of things.
Well, that's a good point. I often wonder what the crossover was between, if there was ever any interactions between Michael Aquino and Berkowitz at his last station there at Fort Knox. They seem to have some overlap in time frames. But so, John, what got you started on this path as far as writing your book, the Before the Son of Sam book, The Submerged History of a Yonkers Cult, which I think is a great way to put the whole scene into perspective of how there was a lot of existing cult activity, prior to this era of the mid 1970s and late 1970s of these murders. But right. What got you interested in the subject in general?
I just picked up Maury's book. I didn't really know much about the case, but I found a copy at a used bookstore, and I was immediately fascinated with it. Even though it by necessity, it was missing a lot of the names, and he used a lot of aliases, for various players sure. in the story. But I took notes on it myself, and I was just really impressed by Maury's research and his writing ability and everything. And then about 2002, I ran into someone who had worked at the Magical Child bookshop in New York. And I asked him what his opinion of the case was, and he was not a fan of Maury at all. Yet he said, I read the book, and I was familiar with Maury's work in the newspapers, prior to the release of the book. And he said, I believe not only was he right that there was a cult and that more than one person than Berkowitz was involved, but that Maury got the specific participants right, meaning the Carr brothers and these sure. other folks. So he said, in spite of the fact that he did not care for Maury, he believed that Maury's thesis was basically correct. So from there, I just I poked around, here and there wherever I could. I started to do some newspaper research, and then got into it full time about late 2018, early 2019.
Okay, well, let me interject you real quick, because you hit some good details there I was unfamiliar with. So you met somebody who worked at the Magical Child bookstore, huh? Was it Peter Levenda?
No, it was another individual. We met on a Zodiac killer chat board, actually. And, because there's such a wide range of people that were interested in that too. But he had mentioned his background, and I thought, well, since he was around for some of this as it was happening, I couldn't resist asking him about the ultimate evil. So yeah, it was when it was a brief conversation, but
Sure.
it was as specific, I think, as he cared to be. But it's interesting that I've told people that back 20, 25 years ago, you could have a legitimate discussion about the case even with people who weren't fans of Maury or Maury's work or whatever.
Right.
And they didn't try to dismiss Maury out of hand and call him a crackpot and call him all these silly names and stuff. The case now is that the other team is completely just irrational and they don't they're just inordinately hostile to everybody who questions.
Seems very vitriolic with all their messaging, right? Everything, all their communication to me.
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and you probably have a lot more insight of that than I do from just kind of watching things, unfold. Because I believe you were involved in some research teams. Is that correct? With in recent years, with some of this vitriolic nature of activities that popped off.
Yeah, and it was tough, because I assumed these people, like one individual in particular, was my friend because we were. This was during COVID, so a lot of us were home and we had a little more time to devote to all this research. So
sure,
we talked to each other nearly every day, and you get pretty close to people under those circumstances, and you just on the basis of the research, you assume that you're all on the same page.
Yeah.
But things got very weird, and I figured out very quickly that we were not all on the same page, unfortunately. But yeah, 2021 was a weird period there, that first half of that year.
Yeah, I like to put a pin on that point as far as some of these activities surrounding and this information that's popped off in recent years, because I want to go back to this magical child situation. That's a very fascinating place to me. And Nate, are you familiar with? Have you ever heard of the Magical Child bookstore? It was one of two only occult bookstores in all of New York City.
No, I'm not familiar with it at all. Actually,
have you ever seen the film Ghostbusters?
Yes. Is that where they found it?
Yeah, Aykroyd based his occult bookstore off of the Magical Child. So this was popular amongst occultists of all varieties, OTO folks, Satanist folks, Mormon folks, Process Church folks, all these characters. Peter Levenda worked there part-time, apparently, according to himself. And again, he's an interesting character, I think, relative to the whole Berkowitz storyline too, because Peter Levenda went to the same high school and ran around in the same social circles, apparently, by his own admission, with David Berkowitz. I actually suspect there's probably more of a, and I don't know, Johnny may have some thoughts on it. I don't want to get too far off on a different tangent. I just think there may be more to the storyline as far as Levenda and his buddy and how maybe Berkowitz ever got linked up with the cars in the first place.
It's always possible that more info is going to emerge, because this case is, I've seen things that I never thought would happen. I've talked to people that I never expected to talk, and things just got, there's always more information out there. The individual I spoke to, he also worked at the shop, and he loved Herman. I think he considered Herman Slater, the owner, sort of a surrogate father, basically. But, Herman would lose his temper and he would fire the guy multiple times, and then he always hired him back. So he had a genuine affection for the store and the person that owned it. But he also had been active in the OTO for a while. And all he told me about that was that it was an acquired taste. So...
Well, that's a weird statement. It's a very weird statement. That's a very weird statement. So Herman Slater is an interesting character, though. So Nate, the guy that ran the Magical Child, he would appear on, what was it, maybe Maury Povich or something, opposite Maury Terry, debating these topics of satanic cults and not specifically the Son of Sam, but the whole satanic panic movement. You'd have folks like Herman Slater here, the owner of this bookstore, opposite Maury Terry on the early 90s TV circuit discussing these topics. Then later I find out, and speaking with all this information that Johnny, you were saying, has popped off in recent years, the release of all these the variations of different Terry files, I'll argue, and I'll go back to it here in a moment with you. But the the release of all these files, and Terry had on a list Herman Slater as a member of the cult. So,
Yeah.
he's literally apparently going on TV, like with full mindset that he's debating a dude from the cult about the cult. You know what I mean? That's got to be a rough environment to go, to voluntarily put yourself into.
Yes, I would say so. Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I have a lot of respect for the man and his work. He may be incorrect in some of his assessments. I'm sure he faced a lot of intentional misleading, various,
Yeah, I think he did, because but he
very
knew he had
walks
to
of
go head to head with these people because they
life.
were
Yeah,
ready to
exactly.
misrepresent him and to misdirect. Yeah, yeah. So he
Yeah,
he just
that's
had to get in there.
that's a good way to frame it. That's what I was trying to get at there with him voluntarily going on these shows, knowing, according to his own notes, knowing that this dude that he's debating is a member of the cult that he's debating about, right? Like,
Right.
That's some balls right there.
Yeah, and
Well,
and
I
these
just
were very, Herman was even by the kindest estimation, he was a strange person, and arguably, according to some evidence, more than strange. He was dangerous. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, very odd stuff. So 2018, you got real heavy into the research, and then you said you were working in a research group come 2020, but
Yeah.
you wrote your book was published in 2020. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, I met some of the folks that I worked with shortly after I published the first version. Then a few months later, there was some additional information that I'd found out and a couple of corrections I wanted to make. So I just added some, a little bit of text to the same book. And but yeah, the first version came out, in fact, almost exactly 5 years ago. It was in February 2020. So
Okay, nice.
yeah, and it put me in contact with various folks, and unfortunately, I
That's what
think,
got you connected was the publishing of the book, and then you
yeah,
got connected with. Oh,
yeah,
nice. Okay.
some folks reached out to me, and I think sadly, people not everybody did this, but some people misrepresented themselves at the beginning, and
Yeah.
yeah, I was working elbow to elbow with them, and unfortunately, their objective was different than mine was.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah.
such an odd environment, isn't it? And so I've been following these activities, and yeah, to be honest with you, I got into the Son of Sam case through Charles Manson, strangely
Mhm.
enough, and that and kind of researching my own heritage. I hail from Fairfield County, Connecticut, and specifically the town of Ridgefield, just across the border there from Westchester County. Actually, my family's home was 2.5 miles away from the Process Church headquarters there.
Oh
In,
wow, yeah.
there in Westchester County. It's basically the same road. You just you take it's a T intersection. One of them you stay in the state, the other one goes across the border into Connecticut, and we had lived right across the border into Connecticut. So I just looking at that whole area, there's a lot of weird cold, like looking at the whole ultimate evil narrative of all the recruitment of Boy Scout troops and stuff like that in the Westchester County area. It seems all that stuff is going on in the Fairfield County, in the Connecticut region as well. And again, a lot of weird stuff going on in and around the town of Ridgefield, that whole area, just opposite of opposite of the that area of Westchester County that seems particularly creepy, if you ask me. That nature preserve region, the Hollywood film sets, they filmed a lot of Hollywood movies right over that little corner of the county there in Westchester, right where the Process Church set up shop is, just adjacent to, once again, film studios. It seems like everywhere they go is from Charles Manson and the Spawn Ranch to the Kanab, Utah Best Friends Animal Society, buying off all that Disney film studio property, and well, not just Disney, but large part Disney. It seems where they go is film studios, movie ranches, if you will.
Yeah, I think they do enjoy being in close proximity to film and filmmakers. Yes, absolutely.
Right. It seems to go hand in hand, right?
Yeah, it does. It does, eerily so. And in fact, I had to make a little bit of a case for that in my book with a really low budget film that unfortunately not many people have seen. It was just kind of a cheap drive-in horror movie, but it was called Invasion of the Blood Farmers. It was shot just about 20 miles north of Yonkers, but still in Westchester County. And the everything about the film, it's just like a thinly fictionalized version of the story that we're talking about. It's this group of dirt farmers. They're disguised, well, they're disguised as dirt farmers. They're actually druids, and they're trying to resurrect their queen through taking the blood of both human and animal victims. Anybody familiar with the larger story that Maury told in The Ultimate Evil is going to find a lot of the plot points of that movie eerily familiar. It's a terrible movie, but there's so much in it that's relevant in relation to this case. But it's a strange little movie. But yeah, it was filmed in Westchester too in 1972.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of strange stuff going on there. So yeah, I getting back to the kind of the evolution of things from my perspective. So I've been following these things. I don't know, at least more specifically conversations relative specifically to the process since around 20. I said probably 20. Circa 20. I lose y'all. My back.
Okay, yeah, you're back. Yeah, I was wondering if it was on my end or if okay.
So, circa 2013, the only folks on the interwebs talking about these subjects, specifically the Process Church and the Son of Sam, both Maury Terry's investigations, generally speaking, was Ed Opperman. I've just I've been on Opperman's show before. We've communicated various topics. He has some good assessments. A lot of these or good analysis on a lot of these cult activities. I think surrounding these topics, and because he's got the evolution of a lot of the the discussion. A lot of the, knowing a lot of the characters involved, Jim Rothstein, he's done numerous interviews with him over the years. So these are the things I've kind of followed, and really over the, I know he's a contentious character. I'm seeing some comments in the chat. I know he's a contentious character, but nonetheless, he is a bit of a historian in these topics relative to his catalog of interviews, and again interactions. Because again, I'm not familiar with. Were you part of this infamous Maury Terry Facebook group? These are things I never really were involved with, but
I never was. I'm just not a great social media person, so I was really never on Facebook for very long. But
sure.
Ed had me on his show a couple of times, and my experience was nothing but great with him. I enjoyed doing the show, and he gave me a platform at a time when a lot of this really terrible stuff was happening and misleading information was getting out, and he allowed me to get on and correct the record. So it was really good to be on there.
Sure.
Yeah.
I heard that interview. It was a good interview for sure. And I highly recommend folks check that out. Even if you don't like Ed Opperman, check out John's interviews on there because he goes into some of these discussions, if I remember correctly.
That's right. Yeah.
Regarding how all of a sudden, he was getting a lot of messages from folks being sent to him, on these topics that all of a sudden there was an uptick in interest. And it's very curious. What is that uptick in interest? Is it the same uptick in interest that has generated now numerous Netflix documentaries on the topic?
Yeah,
seems to be a concerted effort to me. I mean, these are my opinions on the matter from looking over, watching these subjects, reading, I read The Ultimate Evil for the first time probably around 2015, I think it was. Mm-hmm. At the same time I was getting really into Charles Manson. I read every book on, the family. Ed Sanders, The Family, great book on Manson. I highly recommend his stuff. Yeah. Looking at his notes, I was shocked to learn him and Terry remained, close associates for many years up until Terry's death. But it seems that Terry's death was the precipitating event that caused the onslaught of this.
Yeah, I think so. And then a couple of years after that, Berkowitz gave a CBS News interview for the 40th anniversary, I guess, of his arrest. And it was garbled. You could see the video edits, in the interview, and they were just like piecing parts of different sentences together. And I talked to a lot of people after that interview aired who said that was just bizarre. They did a really terrible job with that. And I said, yeah, I thought they did too. And what they were trying to make it sound like was that he had just confessed to the whole hog there, but I don't think they left even one sentence of his intact in that interview. But yeah, there was some interest after that as well. And then I think The Ultimate Evil was out of print for a while, which I didn't realize when I published my book, but people came forward and told me that when I published.
Sure.
And they said that my book at one point was about the only thing that they could get to read on it. And so I tried to encourage everybody to find an old paperback copy of Maury's book if they could, because it was what I had written would really make a lot more sense if they had read Maury first. So, but yeah,
Sure.
fortunately,
That,
it's back in print now, albeit in a butchered version, unfortunately.
well, I don't know I don't know where you started that tangent there, John, but you made a good point there. I cut out there for a moment, but you make a
I'm
good
sorry.
point there about the paper version versus the digital version.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
and back to this where I cut out when we were talking about the concerted effort situation of
Hmm.
this nonsense this goes surrounds these topics these days.
Yeah.
Um, the new digital version, when the new print version from Mr. Siemens, the director of the Netflix documentary The Sons of Sam,
Mhm.
he Dana, there's been some comments in the chat about Dana over there at Rotting Jules and her research and her research team, and something they've concluded over there was comparing the print version versus the digital version, and there's been a number of revisions, including
Yeah.
an entire chapter wiped out, a
Yeah.
very important chapter,
Lots
if
of
you ask
stuff
me.
left out. Yeah. And crucial stuff in many cases, names that are relevant. And yeah, the older a copy that people can find, the better off they'll be with Maury's work. Yeah, it was a really um, unfortunate thing that happened with the latest printing of the book. So
Sure.
I would advise people to stay away from that. But yeah, it was.
So
I
so
don't
you
think
got
that was the accident either.
Oh, I don't think no. It's when you're wiping out an entire chapter on the death mask murders. Which Nate, have you ever heard of some of these murders in New York City around the gay S&M community, the gay clubs? It's very reminiscent of a proto smiley face killer type of murder. To be quite honest with you,
I actually had Nick come on. I think we talked a little bit about that. Yeah, that
nice.
was yeah. Well, specifically, yeah, that is interesting. Jonathan, I had a quick question for you,
Yeah,
and of course, this is all speculation, but you were saying that you had a researcher that was working with you for the book, right? And then at the end, he was kind of twisting some of the information, or he had a different like. How much of that do you think are like disinformation agents? Like the way I look at it, like especially the mainstream like version of like Netflix series now where people are getting like overly obsessed with like serial killers and true crime and this and that. I almost see it as a way of like because they'll even cover things like Jeffrey Epstein and things like that. You're going to have the big guys talking about Jeffrey Epstein. It seems like a way of just like painting the narrative and having the allowable version of like what happened, and so they can like cover up all the actual crazy shit that happened. It seems very concerted. It seems like it's very planned. Like I think, especially with Netflix nowadays, like that's Edward Bernays' nephew, Mark Rudolph, right? It's pretty
sure.
fascinating. Like like he was the father of propaganda, right? It seems like all of this has connections back to again, always back to the CIA to me, MK Ultra. Like all of this stuff seems pretty like connected with the CIA and things like that, covering things up and. You get what's the word that I'm looking for? You get a limited hangout, right? And so you get to talk about the bad guy, but you get to talk about it in this kind of like in the 3x5 card of like allowable
Absolutely.
opinion.
Yes, I could not agree more. And there's one person in particular who is guilty of that. And yeah, I think a lot of this is largely choreographed and deliberate. I wrote the book on my own, and then what I found as I progressed into research with my former colleagues is they never came right out and said, we want you to change some of the conclusions that you came to in your book. But that was the general idea. They started to there started to be more and more friction about particular conclusions about particular suspects that I had made. And I knew I was right because I had done the research to begin with, and then
Sure.
I was continuing the research even as we worked together. And there were a couple of suspects in particular, and a couple of situations related to Son of Sam that they really, when I persisted in researching these areas, they really had a problem with it. So yeah, I think a lot of this is it's a calculated effort, unfortunately, and
Oh,
they
for
have
sure.
a
And
lot
well
of
financed.
a lot of media and government weight behind them. Yeah, yeah,
They get nervous when you're hovering over the target.
yes,
Well,
they do, and their nervousness rapidly turns into like querulous anger, and they get really really petty. about some things, but I'm pretty stubborn, so I just stuck to my guns.
So, Jonathan, I also briefly read just a little connection that was David Berkowitz. Was he a member of the Process Church? But also, I heard that he was a member of the Scientology. Is that correct, or where is the connection there?
He was, he joined the Yonkers cult. There's a little bit of, and I think this is one of the areas that's a little confusing in Maury's book, is there was a pre-existing cult in Yonkers that started in about the early to mid 50s. The Process came into the picture somewhere in the late 60s, early 70s, and they sort of co-opted this pre-existing cult. The cult was still there, and they still met in Untermeyer Park, but it appears to be the Process that was calling a lot of the shots by that point. So David may have never been a member of the Process per se, but he definitely was a member of the local Yonkers cult, and they got their marching orders from the Process at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and then the Process moved out of Manhattan about 1978, or at least a wing of the Process did, and relocated to Atlanta.
Yeah, and Dave, if I can put a better perspective or just a different perspective on the idea of the Process, like different isn't not just thinking of it as a generally accepted just cult. I look at it more as you're pointing out the intelligence Satanists, intersection of these activities.
Yeah.
So this was a roll up operation, in my opinion. So they're rolling up these various cults, and that's why they have the four deities as their gods: Jesus, Satan, Lucifer, and Jehovah, because that way they can basically roll up any cult into their mix, right? So it's a roll up operation for hood rat shit, which, as John pointed out, they go to Atlanta, and what pops off in Atlanta, the Atlanta child killings.
That's right. Yeah, the Process were. I feel pretty satisfied to say that they emerged directly from MI6, British intelligence, Tavistock Institute. That was the ground out of which the Process grew. Yeah.
I totally agree with you there. In Tavistock, they got their hands in all sorts of activity, including the transgendered apocalypse that's currently plaguing the Western world. That actually originated in Tavistock.
Yes.
Recently got shut down too. The UK government was like, Tavistock, you're done. So see how that works out.
There does seem to have finally been a line that people were unwilling to go beyond. So yeah.
Which is good. I mean, as a victim of the transpocalypse myself, the introduction to tonight's show, Buffalo Jared Revisa, currently awaiting murder trial in the states of Connecticut and Massachusetts for a multi-state stabbing spree where he also pissed on a McDonald's. I don't know why he did that, but it's what he did. So it was a fun-filled afternoon for all Buffalo Jared, but he clearly, he's a very, I kind of view him as a mind-controlled mind-controlled transpocalypse situation of these killers that have been popping off. And I don't know that that's all that different from the Son of Sam situation, because, that's kind of the goal, from my assessment, at least, that's kind of the goal of this wrap-up operation of the Process. That seems to be kind of the goal, is to do these various, not just small chaotic events creating chaos throughout specifically America, but I don't give a shit about other countries. But they're associated with almost every major socio-political assassination murder event for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the origin. So there is, I'm sure John's fully aware of this contentious subject of the Process, because you watch things like, again, this concerted effort, right? The propaganda, as you're pointing out with the Netflix, there is the Sons of Sam documentary. It says the Process disbanded in 1974, which is the official, ridiculous tagline that gets, repeated over and over. It's clearly false. I mean, it's all false on its face.
Yeah.
There's really the debate doesn't exist except for the people trying to lie about it, right? But yeah, so you have that whole debate, but regardless of that debate, these people can call themselves whatever they want. They're doing the same activities, and time again, from RFK, to the Son of Sam, to you essentially attempts on Gerald Ford. If you want to bring in the Manson situation, as Maury does in The Ultimate Evil, and I think he does it for great reason. There's some deep Manson process connections. So, you know, and there's a lot to be said for these activities, and a lot of things that have gotten ignored over the years that have come to light in recent years. Is the Westchester County is a hotbed of activity with the Process Church. So, but, you know, it's not just the Yonkers cult, as you're pointing out, John, that Berkowitz is clearly a part of, but seems to have been, as you're pointing out, the puppet masters of that Yonkers cult was, by the 1970s, was members of the Process, and Berkowitz has pointed these people out.
That's right. Yes.
In fact, the guy you pointed out lives a very, very affluent lifestyle in a very prosperous, Baltimore, Maryland suburb. Which I say prosperous. There's not very many Baltimore, Maryland suburbs that aren't. They're pretty rough around there. So there's a few nice areas of town. The healthcare CEO killer Luigi Mangione. He grew up in a nice area of the suburbs of Baltimore. Well, I'd say this is the second nice area with the former or probably still current Process guy. Who
speaking of MK Ultra puppets, that could have been another one.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yes, this individual in Maryland, he just tells people that he was in a commune. He just
right.
says he spent the wacky 60s and early 70s in a commune, and I believe he leaves it at that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's possibly one of the greater tragedies of this entire tale. Is a lot of these folks that were involved in this hood rat shit and around the Process and around the Son of Sam Yonkers cult. They went on to die of an old age.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, lived out their natural lives.
And speaking of Netflix, the popular Netflix series Stranger Things, I believe one of the producers of that show was a fellow by the name of Gadusek. In fact, that fellow's uncle was Carlton Gadusek.
Yeah,
he was a member of
a loaded name. Yeah,
he's a member. Correct me if I'm wrong. He's an integral member, right, in the Yonkers cult scene. Correct, John?
He is alleged to have been. Yeah, he and people should know he actually was a convicted child molester.
Oh,
we're not just talking hypotheticals. He actually was convicted and served a year in prison. So yeah.
What was he bringing, like 50 young boys back from Micronesia or some nonsense?
Yeah, lots of boys, and he right around the investigation into Gadusek and the reopening of the Son of Sam case in 1996. I think a lot of minds started to change even back then because suddenly more specific information was available, and people like Gadusek, who were allegedly connected to the case, you could suddenly see real names and faces that were connected to the case, whereas before it was something you read in a book and it was interesting, but you think like, well, geez, could I research this, or could I find out these people's names? And all of a sudden you saw more, at least a few more names and faces, and the case became a lot more concrete for a lot of people.
It is funny. It's funny. All of these people are always related, like you said. That Netflix, that guy that made the Project Monarch, that connection right there with the MK Ultra stuff.
Sure.
Yeah, with Stranger Things.
Sure. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's big time. Yeah. Mind control. Project stuff. For
all
sure.
These
so, do you know who got? So after Nate, you'll enjoy this fun fact about old Carlton Gadusek. After he left the Yonkers scene there, he moved to Washington, D.C. and went to go work directly for Anthony Fauci.
There you go, dude. It's a big club and you ain't in it. Yeah.
That's for damn sure. It was actually Fauci he was working for at the time when he, no one had any questions. This big fat doctor dude who works for the NIH just brings back 50 young boys from some strange South Pacific island. Is like, no, it's cool. I'm their mentor. No one had any questions for the guy. You know what I mean? Like, It's a little ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's that Fauci coverage. That dude's hooked in, man. He's networked in.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So I'm curious, when do we know he got involved in that cult, and how much of that? Because I'm also curious too, because he briefly mentioned, or he did start talking about like being involved in a satanic cult, but before his testimony was talking about a black dog. He was talking about a dog that was speaking to him.
Right.
Do you give that any credence? Like, how crazy was this guy? Was that after the
Yeah.
acid wore off? You started talking about the actual
yeah,
stuff that was going on, or
yeah, that was Harvey. He was he was the Carr's dog, the Carr family's dog. No, I don't. I've never seen the least evidence that Berkowitz is insane or does not have a grip on reality. He was. I think you could say he was an unhappy person, for various reasons, but I think that's about as far as it went. He, he got involved with some very strange people, and then, as we were talking about earlier, there does seem to have been some event that prefigured all of this, possibly in the military or um, from his friendship with a mutual friend who knew both him and the Carrs. He knew this guy from a very young age, but so Berkowitz may have been introduced to, or at least made aware of the cult as early as the late '60s or early '70s. But by the time he comes back home and he's gotten involved, we know he's involved by 1975. I think he's just an unhappy person who's in over his head, and they've, the cult would threaten family members, and they would say, we're, we can hurt your parents or your siblings, or whatever. And so he didn't want his father to get hurt, so he found himself doing some things that he really didn't want to do. And for what it's worth, I think he's sincerely regretful about that. I think he is still conflicted. But I think he sincerely regrets his involvement in this and the fact that he hurt anybody. The campaign to make himself look mentally unstable was just that. I think it was a campaign on the part of the group
for sure,
to make his confession as the lone killer more effective and believable. So
yeah. The group and Rupert Murdoch's New York Post was happy to run with it. Happy to run with these narratives.
Yes.
So as far as he goes, do you think that they sort of like found him? Because always to me, it's like they try to find, it's exactly what the FBI does now, right? Where they try to find kind of a kid that's troubled, kind of a kid that, like, because it sounds like he liked to start fires in his earlier years, right?
Yeah.
He was kind of, they kind of found a kid who's like, he didn't have a good father figure. He was kind of a troubled kid. He had like emotional issues. He got kicked out of the military. He was perfect.
Yeah, that's prime cult material right there.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think they did see in him the kind of person that they could use. And as Maury said in the book, David was a little bit of a firebug. He was interested in that. And this group, they were, you do find fires consistently year after year in the vicinity of where these people operated before and during the Son of Sam years. That this was a major preoccupation of theirs. By the time that they're planning the Son of Sam attacks and Berkowitz is actually at the planning meeting, I think they saw him as the kind of person who was loyal enough and tight-lipped enough that he could be read into the actual planning of the attacks. So he was there when they planned it, in the spring of 1976, him and one other member of the local cult who is an interesting figure in his own right. But yeah.
Well, if we can kind of move from there back. That's a good point that you make, John. But this cult, this Yonkers cult, as we're calling it, I've seen some comments that Untermeyer Park was one of their primary meeting spaces, which is an interesting place, Untermeyer Park, with an interesting history. But this cult before Berkowitz was there, I mean, it was recruiting teenage. Berkowitz was recruited in his early 20s, but this was recruiting folks as early as their teenage years, from my understanding. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. All the way back in the early 60s. Excuse me, I think I may start getting a cold myself, but hope I can hold it off for at least a couple hours here. But yeah, John Carr allegedly was a recruiter for the group at that point. He's 14, 15 years old, so he's recruiting people that he knows from school. And in 1961, he recruits a friend of his named Paul Rainieri, who became a very important witness later in the case that Maury interviewed extensively, and who was also interviewed by the police later in his life. But he was initiated into the cult in the spring of 1961. This was a brutal initiation where he and other teenagers were, drugged, bent over in the park, sodomized, boys and girls. Uh, they heard dogs being killed behind them. They had dog blood poured over their bodies after the dogs were killed. This is before the process ever came into the picture. This is how brutal the cult already was in the early 60s, So they were, as Maury describes it, and Paul Ranieri agreed, they were kind of a ritual magic cult. They performed rituals associated with Aleister Crowley, the Golden Dawn, that kind of stuff, but they were preoccupied primarily with sex with teenage boys, although there also were some young girls involved in it as well.
That sounds like Aleister Crowley.
Yes, absolutely. Right? Absolutely.
Yeah, Crowley. Whenever I think of Crowley, he's definitely into butt stuff. Now,
it's magic, okay? He's into magic.
Super magical.
That excuses everything, yeah.
So speaking of these brutal initiations, John Paul Ranieri, correct me if I'm wrong, he also has a story there where he apparently would later in life drug Jeffrey Dahmer, take him back to his apartment there in Milwaukee. Ranieri was living in Milwaukee at this time. Drugs Jeffrey Dahmer at a gay club, takes him home, and brutally rapes him with like a candlestick or something like that.
I have heard different. He definitely copped to knowing Dahmer, or at least meeting him, being acquainted with him. I've heard different versions of the story.
Yeah, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's a candlestick, maybe it's a lamppost. Right. Who knows?
Yeah, and so I don't, about the particulars. I'm not sure how.
Sure.
It was, in reality, but he did. I'm pretty well satisfied that he actually did know Dahmer. Paul was, he's another one of these conflicted people. He had a very, he was already sort of awkward when he was initiated into the cult, and then from there, his whole existence was just so scarred, that it's almost just unbelievable how anybody could even survive those years that he survived, in the cult.
Sure. I mean, that's some brutal stuff for sure.
Just beyond, it's painful to read about.
Absolutely.
But
stuff they witnessed for sure. Yeah. I mean, even the sacrifice of animals. I mean, that's got to be some traumatizing effects on the psyche.
I think so. Yeah. He mentioned that in particular in one of his interviews with Maury. He said, I didn't see it, but I can still hear those dogs yelping and howling behind me the night that they initiated me. So it was a lifelong, nightmarish memory.
I imagine so. The Mormons forced me to chop off some chickens' heads on a Mormon pioneer camping trip when I was a teenager. Man. That's still traumatizing.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It's and stuff like that does have a lingering effect. No matter, I don't care how much counseling you have or how much medication you can take. There are going to be times where you're just sitting around not thinking about anything in particular, and those things are going to come back to you. It's
I said
awful.
Yeah, for sure. I say that somewhat in jest, but obviously, the sacrifice. I mean, cutting off a chicken's head, that's dinner. But obviously, witnessing the sacrifice of all these dogs, which seems to be the MO of these cults, right? Like whatever it is they're up to, there's a trail of dead dogs that goes around with this cult.
There is, and with these people in particular, the German Shepherds seem to have been really significant to their, I don't know what you would call it, doctrine or theology or whatever, but there were always German Shepherds, even before the process, which is interesting because we can trace the presence of German Shepherds in that neighborhood, in the Berkowitz neighborhood, all the way back to 1925, when a man who lived at 22 Wicker Street, which figures prominently in the case, that's right around the corner from the cars and just below the building that Berkowitz lived in, he had a vicious German Shepherd that got loose and attacked a female pedestrian. That house, 22 Wicker, is right alongside the aqueduct path that leads to Untermeyer Park. So
you
find the presence of these kinds of dogs in particular going all the way back, a century now. So this was in March of 1925. So something odd was happening in that neighborhood for a long time. So, yeah.
So, and that's kind of one of the key tenets of your book, correct? Is this cult activity that does date back in Yonkers with the similar ritualistic activities, like you're pointing out with the dead dogs, back to the 1920s.
Yes, that's right. The odd little
It's a
stories that
long span.
it really is. And I ran up on that story almost by accident. I was looking for something else entirely, but I kept finding odd incidents in that neighborhood. Um, and I thought, well, what was happening here, and what was the significance of it? And there are still a lot of questions to be answered, but I think I found enough circumstantial evidence to indicate that there was cult activity there from a pretty early date. Yeah.
Now,
Hey Jonathan, we had somebody in the chat asking about your book. Do you want to do a quick plug?
Oh,
Her
sure.
name is Katie. She has a true crime podcast. Actually, I'd love to hook you guys up after this. She has a pretty good little following there. I think that would be awesome. But yeah, here's the book. And Jonathan, if you want to just do a quick little plug, sorry, this is your show, JJ. But
no, knock it out. In fact, I sent you a private message to put that in your Rumble chat. The link to that.
Right on.
I posted it here, but I realized it was in your Rumble chat it came from. Now go ahead, John.
Sure. Yeah, it's mainly about the cult prior to Berkowitz, although I do touch on Berkowitz and the Son of Sam murders and even the aftermath there to some extent. But it's mainly about the history of the cult prior to Berkowitz, and I just tried to make it as real and solid as I could for the reader, and use as many real names and as many real, verified incidents from newspapers or research that I conducted with family members or friends of suspects and victims as I possibly could find. So it's about 45 pages long, and it's just I intended it just as a kind of supplement to Maury's book.
Awesome.
So thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. And Desert Rain's asking, is there another place to purchase this besides Amazon?
I don't have any hard copies now, unfortunately, but and I believe Desert Rain follows me on X or Twitter, so I'd be happy if she can't get it via Kindle. I could just send her the text. I could just send it as a Google share thing, but I'd be happy to do that if she can't read it electronically.
And there you go, Desert Rain. Yeah, she's a prolific Twitter user. We definitely we communicate on there quite a bit. So
yeah, I'd be glad to.
I'm sure y'all can connect on there for sure.
Okay.
Yep, there she goes. Yep. So I think that's an interesting. You bring up an interesting perspective. Have the soup in which this later Yonkers process church cult movement would grow into. And I think one of the interesting perspectives, at least to me, is relative to these topics and the intelligence operations, et cetera, is the deep state nature of these satanic cults, specifically, not just the Keno, but specifically the process church, relative to tonight's conversation. And one of the interesting law enforcement characters you find there in Yonkers running the police department in the time frame you're talking about. In fact, he was a sergeant in the detective bureau in Yonkers, was none other than James Comey's grandfather, William Comey.
Yeah.
And I often wonder, do characters like James Comey, William Comey would later retire as the head of the Yonkers PD. He was the commissioner.
Well, New York in general, it's kind of like it's old mafia families. Like if you want to be a somebody in New York, your grandfather had to be a somebody in New York.
Right. Exactly.
It really is.
No, that's for sure. That's a great way to put it. That is how it goes. Yeah. So, but I look at the people like Comey. I'm like, well, yeah, again, like you said, he's born into these positions, so he's inheriting these roles. And I think it's interesting that the key role he plays, he was deemed a Republican for many years. It's just, that's tomfoolery, uniparty nonsense. But what he really was the Clinton bag man. Even though George Bush was appointing him to various positions within the Department of Justice, the roles he was coming in for private industry to bury a Clinton situation. For example, his first one was he was assigned by George Bush to investigate Bill Clinton's pardon of a fellow by the name of Mark Rich. Bill Clinton, one of his out the door pardons, was a guy who was the number one man on he was on the FBI's most wanted list. I think he was maybe number 2. He was a George Soros type character named Mark Rich. He hadn't even been convicted of anything to be pardoned from. He was simply charged in on an FBI's wanted list, and Clinton pardoned him. So there was a lot of I still don't think it's legal, but they brought Comey in to do one of these numbers and say it was legal. So that was his first job as far as being the Clintons' bagman. So I find it interesting. He's from Westchester County. They're in Westchester County. That's where they set up shop. There's a lot of weird stuff. I'm not advocating for Westchester County to be, nuclear bombed or anything. I'm just saying there's a lot of weird shit that goes on in Westchester County. A lot of occult stuff, the Rockefeller estates there. A lot of old money stuff going on there. The Kennedys, for example,
Yeah.
RFK, when he was murdered by the process, ostensibly murdered by the process, as all the legends go, and all the evidence seems to suggest. Sirhan Sirhan attending process, sex rituals apparently as well, according to some investigative reports. But nonetheless, RFK, senator from New York at the time, lived in Westchester County.
But don't worry, the government investigated itself and found that they were just fine.
Hey, look, guys, we're not guilty, all right? I just think, there's some of these elements. So, one of the other elements I think that comes to mind is the seemingly deep connections between the upper echelon of the national security state of America and, the Nazis that took over in 1947, via the National Security Act. The deeply connected folks who were making those national security decisions, stamping things national security, which I think takes like 3 signatures. Folks like Henry Kissinger, his close connections with this process church activity there out of Westchester County, and his underling, Brent Scowcroft, who would employ as an assistant and apparently a speechwriter a leader in the Neo Process Church, a fellow by the name of J.J. Bryan. Real creepy son of a bitch. Operated a number of art galleries. Very spooky. He was involved doing some really weird malicious stuff. I believe in Lebanon, he got picked up doing some spook stuff. But anyhow, he was a prominent leader in this Neo Process movement. Again, right-hand man to Henry Kissinger's right-hand man. This guy was, after Kissinger, Scowcroft was a national security advisor to numerous presidents. So we're talking about 2 dudes who are on a short list of folks stamping things national security, who seem to be deeply interrelated with the process church. So it's not just Coney.
I think the influence does extend all the way up the ladder, unfortunately. There are people in positions of huge power who really are into this stuff, and they're serious about it.
Right. Yeah. Right. It seems that way, right? And seems like that was kind of Maury's stuff. So I don't want to go too far into the whole Maury's notes debacle. I mean, I do want to discuss it somewhere here with you, but how far have you gotten into some of those files and releases of files of the quote unquote Terry files, the what I just like to call the limited hangout, but the Terry files that were released?
I'm pretty familiar with them by now, and there was a point where I stayed up for about 3 days reading through all of them, and then I slept for a little while and went through them again. But yeah, there's a wealth of stuff in there, and it confirms not only some of the things Maury said over the years, most of what he said, in fact, but it also confirmed large parts of what I was saying, what I suspected, and what I concluded via my own research. So the files definitely were helpful. I mean, they named
put a lot of names of those pseudonyms, right?
Well, yeah, we only knew them as pseudonyms, or in fact, there were some people that he didn't know about at all when he wrote the original book that we know about now. And he, by 1997, he had typed up what he called a flipper list of witnesses, meaning people that he thought were or could be flipped or should be, by the police, who could offer enough evidence to conclusively solve the case. And he typed up a list of, I don't know, at least a couple of dozen people, but
one of which was Abe Beam's son, right? The mayor of New York.
Abe Beam had an aide who was deeply involved in this stuff. Yeah.
Well, I believe one of his son was on that same list, if I'm not mistaken. I believe is an Ed Beam, maybe.
I'm trying to think if the son. I know of the 2 aides, and one of them was a close aide. I would have to go back and see if the son was on there. I'm not sure.
That brings me to
that part for sure.
That brings me to my next point. Point. If I just may make this point, though, Nate, once again, if the mayor's son is in the cult and the New York City's, they're not going to investigate the mayor and his son. Like the mayor's son's not going to, you know what I mean? Like I think that's the nature of people want to say there was investigations into these things. Were there? I mean, there's a lot of things to point to that there wasn't, but I'm just saying, like, when you take into that factor, like they're not going to do shit if the mayor's son's involved in these kind of activities or the mayor's aides.
Right. When it extended that far, there was no way on it, because we know that just before Berkowitz's arrest, they were searching for the yellow VW that had been seen at the last attack.
Right.
moment Berkowitz is arrested, all that stuff about the yellow VW, the sketches of what are obviously different suspects, all of that just goes completely out the window. And all of a sudden, it's just this one guy. So yeah, the case, they never even made a case. They just said, this is the guy. And he agreed that he was the guy. And that was the end of it. They never made any sort of airtight case against David Berkowitz at all. And I think a lot of people probably don't realize that. They assume that he went to trial. He didn't. He just confessed. That's it. That's the end of it.
Yeah, and Andy had his like a joint hearing of all three counties judges came into one room and they all just convicted him at once.
Yes,
it's very unheard of. American jurisprudence was.
Yeah.
Another character that may factor in this powerful network that has put a lid on these things, fella, you're going to be familiar with their Nate, Roy Cohn.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, he made the list. He's on Terry's list as being a member of this cult. Something that's only really come to light in recent years when Terry's files became public. Through varying measures in which to keep those away from the public that have been going on since 2016. It appears they include folks like James Franco, Hollywood actor and alleged rapist of young women. James Franco. So I think there's a lot of these characters that have factored into that. But yeah, on these notes, so yeah, John, it seems to me I have a list. I got a list of files circa August, I think, of 2023. Yeah, 2023. Comparing those files to things like this website, I'm like, well, there's something going on here. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's an effort. Speaking to this concerted effort, I'm like, well, when you start comparing some of the stuff that I was sent versus the information on this now infamous website, The People versus David Berkowitz, which I believe populated around that same time.
It did, yeah. I think there are very relevant things on that website, including the flipper list, which I find very significant and was a lot of help in confirming my own research.
Let me pull up that list real quick while you're talking about it. And do you remember which section?
It's it'll be in the newly added documents, and there's pretty far down the index page. There is a Maury Terry page, and it's all in capitals. Let's see.
Am I in the right department?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe just a little bit further down. Newly updated Maury Terry investigation files page on December 16th of 2023. And I believe it's going to be to the side there. That just below that right there. Maury Terry's list of individuals alleged to be Son of Sam cult members and associates. Yeah, that's a very helpful list. That'll show people a lot of the names that they've always wondered about and explain, at least some of their significance in relation not just to the Son of Sam crimes, but to their long-term membership in the cult. The first two names on that list are Ace Brown and Sue Conway.
Yeah,
I've made it.
I'm loading it up right now. I'm trying to at least.
Yeah. There's Ace definitely was number one, but Sue would be a close second. I've researched her for a number of years, and it only got more sordid and more interesting. She was I don't want to spoil it, but there's a lot about her in my booklet that I think people will find interesting.
Yeah, so this is these are some relevant points. This is great stuff you're saying here, John. So these documents, I have a different list of documents,
right,
than what's on that website. And it's not like I haven't done an all-inclusive thing, but like even the letters from Berkowitz, I have a different list of letters from Berkowitz. And like you said, you stayed up and read all these things when you started looking at these files. I did the same thing.
Yeah.
I haven't read them in about a year. At least an overview. But I mean, I have a pretty good memory. I can tell you what's in those files, and I can tell you what just looking at that website. Not only Dana over there at Roddy Jules has pointed out the folks on that website that are listed as process church members, numerous parties are misidentified. Whether or not that's intentional or not, I'm leaning towards it probably is. But
some of the names on the photos, are. I'm trying to think of one example. There's a sketch of a guy named Jeff, and then there's somebody else who is also identified as Jeff, but they're two different people. And I can't remember who the guy who's misidentified is, but I've saw some of that. Yeah,
sure. I know one of them is Robert de Grimson's brother. They have him listed as Robert de Grimson, even though it's his brother.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I
Mike,
think
I guess my question is,
Fridaze's name is misspelled. I don't know if that was intentional or just
sure.
that part could have been an honest mistake, but you never know. Yeah.
So, have you ever seen any documents with? So those are the documents that you've seen? Are just the folks off the People versus David Berkowitz?
And that is part of it. Yeah, what
Yeah.
they have posted is part of it. There are other things, various. Maury wrote a lot of things down by hand in later years,
Sure.
and a lot of it is difficult to read. But there's a lot of that sort of stuff too.
I just think it's weird. So you have these different these are the Terry files, right, on this website, right? We were just looking at. And I have a different set. It seems like there was even maybe a third different set of stuff that was sent out. It just seems like there was this again back to these concerted efforts, this misinformation, disinformation campaign. I don't know what the end game is to do this, but it seems like this was a concerted effort to send varying, maybe again the list of folks that I have in mind are we can go over to a future show if you'd like. It's different than what's on that website. I just wanted to kind of get your ideas on what you thought of what's going on here. Like, what do you think is going on with the shifty nature of this? So if Maury Terry dies, and his files are suddenly this weird, contentious matter, and there's varying releases of these. It feels like a WikiLeaks release. You know what I mean? Like they're suddenly just dropping these random tranches of files on folks. And they're different files. I'm not saying WikiLeaks sends out different files. I'm just saying these weird drops of these files. Just why wouldn't it all be at once? Why wouldn't it be like Ed Sanders in the library that he donated his stuff to Princeton Library? I've seen it. It's not very well organized, but at least it's kind of collected in one spot, right, and available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be curious to see what the second batch looks like because I don't know if I've seen any of that at all. But that's interesting. The people Maury identified there in the flipper list, I know just from my own research and from talking to various folks who knew about Maury's research at the time that those folks definitely were involved, but those are like first tier level of the the street level members of the cult. So those folks definitely were involved. We're talking about the Sue Conways, the John DeFrenzas, the Richie Sperrazas, those folks. They definitely were involved. But I'd be curious to see this additional batch of stuff because I don't know if I've seen any of that.
Interesting.
Suzanne Lee, she was and of course Tiny Lentini was involved.
Yeah, so Lentini's not even on the list that I'm talking about. I mean, I'm saying it's just the whole. The files are totally different.
That may be a shorter list. Was it did it say something about like being a working list of the 22 disciples? Maybe was it a list like that?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that may have been, and I think that was just a working list at one time. I'm not sure what the date of that was, but Maury tidied that up and ended it later. Yeah. But he had a working list that I think Howard Weiss he added in handwriting at the bottom, and he was a friend of Berkowitz's. He definitely was like associated with the cult, but Berkowitz said he wasn't a member. But yeah, I think the first list had maybe a couple dozen people on it, or thereabouts. Yep. Yeah.
So, Jonathan, how active is this cult still ongoing? Is this cult kind of dried up at this point? And we kind of know that, kind of like what you said earlier, JJ. It's like I don't remember the metaphor you used, but it's kind of like how they say the Illuminati ended in 1785. Well, we know it didn't, right? So if this cult is still ongoing, is Berkowitz actually naming names at this point? I'm curious, how much money do we have to put in his commissary to get him on the show? Do you think?
I don't know. He did name names to Maury when this case was reopened. In 1996, 97. He did. He signed off on a longer list, which is also been posted to the People versus Berkowitz page. Since then, I believe he has been very reluctant to talk about the case in general. I think the information we have in Maury's files is probably as close as we're going to get to saying, okay, this is definitely who is involved. I'm sure other people were involved who have not been named, who we can't identify, unfortunately, probably at this point. But But this is a pretty good guidebook here, just the flipper list, because um, I can't tell you how many dozens of awkward phone calls I've made, emails I've sent. Sometimes I've sent letters even in the mail when I couldn't find any other way to get in touch with somebody. And I have actually gotten people to contact me back via snail mail. But what Maury typed out here in this list, these were the core people who were involved. And they, if you find people who knew them, a lot of times people won't talk. A lot of times people are still uncomfortable about it, regardless of the passage.
It's the mafia, right?
Yeah,
it's kind of a mob mentality.
It really is, yeah. But sometimes you run up on somebody and you just catch them in the right mood, and they tell you some pretty good stuff. Yeah.
So according to this blurb here regarding this Quentin Bieber fella, it's like Jane Mansfield was seen at Untermeyer Park rituals.
Yeah, she was. In fact, Paul Rainieri said he met her there and that she participated in one of their occult sex rituals. I don't know if they were actually married or not, but her manager, and he was her boyfriend anyway, but possibly they were married. I'm a little fuzzy on if they were common law or if they were legally married, but was a fellow named Matt Simber, who was from Yonkers and he'd grown up there, gone to high school there.
Oh.
Kind of a shady character. He directed a really strange movie later in life called The Witch Who Came from the Sea, which is a very disturbing, bizarre movie about child sexual abuse. He was around that scene too. Quentin Beaver was part of that little actors troupe, the St. Mary's Players. And Berkowitz recalled him as somebody who was also associated with the cult. In particular, its odd sex practices and sex parties. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think to answer your question, to provide some context, Nate, to your question there, not only is this stuff going on, but again, speaking to whether or not Berkowitz named folks. Yeah, I mean, all throughout Berkowitz and Terry, from what I've seen throughout their correspondences, they had a very close relations. And looking at some of their letters back and forth from each other in Terry's files. For many years, talking all sorts of subjects from sports to life, but nonetheless, he definitely seemed to trust Terry. And again, pointed, a lot of the stuff Terry investigated himself, from my understanding, but Berkowitz would confirm. But nonetheless, he has provided information. But speaking again to is this stuff going on? Well, Jane Mansfield's daughter is a very prominent actress in Hollywood still today. So, or at least the New York side of Hollywood, right? I believe one of the Law and Order shows.
That's right. Yeah.
So, you have the offsprings of these folks. And again, speaking of another offspring that's famous in this kind of process church narrative, one Terry Melcher of the Beach Boys fame, he wrote one of their famous song from the Tom Cruise bartending film from the 80s, Cocktail, Kokomo, written by Terry Melcher, son of Doris Day, who Doris Day is all up involved in this kind of Hollywood process angles. So is Terry Melcher, who was living there at the Tate Polanski home prior to Tate Polanski moving in, and knew and was friends with Charles Manson. So
I didn't. You and I were talking about it a little bit before we even got started recording about my crazy father, and I wonder sometimes if he had some weird. He must have had some weird CIA connections or MK Ultra connections, but he was good friends with one of the Beach Boys. I don't remember which one, the bad one. Whichever the bad one was, because I know that he did heroin with him, and my father was a crazy heroin addict, but also
so he was living in Los Angeles in the late 60s.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, yeah. So I think most of the time he lived near Lompoc, but he
so Santa Barbara.
Yeah, that area. But he went everywhere from the Bay Area, so like San Francisco, because I know he knew Osley. He was getting acid from straight from the source, and then he was taking it back to Southern
CIA right there, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
The Osley LSD batches. That's CIA.
I know my mom met him. I know my mom met Charles Manson as well. We talked a little bit about that earlier. That Charles Manson was a friend of my father. My father was his drug dealer, and
that's wild.
Yeah. There's weird connections all throughout there. Yeah, they had a little house.
Would be considered the bad Beach Boy. He died in I think 1980, I believe.
Yeah, they all hung out at a place they called the House of the Rising Sun. Actually, they had a house they called,
really?
That's what they called it. And I don't know if if they named it after the song or the song was named after there. But
was it the Animals?
I don't remember, dude. I
know
didn't
the
pay
song.
attention to any of this. I wish my dad was still alive. Actually, he died in 2007.
Yeah, the Animals. Yeah,
interesting stuff.
Your father passed in 2007. I walked on you there, Nate. No, yeah. So were you close with the man?
As close as you can be with a heroin addict. He was, you know, he's.
It sounded like maybe he had some trouble past with him with his drug addiction. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you hear from him every once in a while.
And, tales.
Yeah. Nice. He was an interesting guy. You know, he was a nice guy, generous guy, but also could be prone to extreme violence. Like I just remember stories of some dude called my mom fat or something in the middle of the store, and my dad beat him half to death with like a blackjack, and then they had to run out of the store. You know, just wild stories like that. But he never. Well, okay, I won't say he never got caught because he did. He was in and out of prison sometimes.
Some time.
Yeah, he definitely did some time. Interesting stuff. Who kidnapped the real JJ? Yeah, people have been commenting about you looking 10 years younger and maybe you're a clone of yourself.
Right, I saw that was pretty good. The beardless wonder. No, that's pretty wild. So, how do you think your father got associated with some of these activities? Was it through the drug use?
It had an
outlaw biker dude.
No, he wasn't a biker dude. He was a beaner. He was a interesting guy. I'm trying to think of anything that really could have got him connected. I know that when he was in prison, they made him the head of the Brown Beret. It was like a prison gang. They put him in charge of some things like that. He didn't necessarily want to be, but yeah, I don't really know actually how he really got connected. It must have just been through drugs and I don't know enough about him, honestly. Like, I don't know that side of him. I could try. I've been trying to get my mom on the show for years because
start asking her.
Yeah, start asking
her. Put her on the lamp, start interrogating her. Yeah. Tell me what you know. Give me a name. No, that's a wild tale, though, man. That's I appreciate you sharing that for sure because I think that's an interesting perspective you bring up with that tale because one of the things I think it's and John can probably speak to this or. Please feel free to interject anytime here, John. The point where everyone wants to say, like, how did David Berkowitz get associated with these prominent doctors and lawyers and socialites in this cult movement in Yonkers? Well, it's the drug movements. It's the drug culture. Much like your father probably associated with Dennis Wilson, they probably read a heroin drug. I mean, no disrespect to your father, but I'm just saying, like, this is how these things happen. You're at a heroin drug den. You're like, oh shit, are you a Beach Boy? You're like, yeah, let's do some fucking heroin together. You know what I mean?
My dad was a charming guy.
It's more complicated. I don't think it's more complicated than that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So one thing, Berkowitz, a lot of it involved him going to pick up drugs somewhere or holding drugs, and then somebody would come to him and they would take the drug. Sure. Yeah, a lot of it revolved around that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I think that's a lot of how these interactions and associations do occur. It is the cult scene, it's the drug scene, it's a little bit of both, maybe. Sometimes I wonder. Another infamous tale about Berkowitz. Nate, you'll appreciate this one. At least my thoughts on it. I think you'll appreciate. Another infamous tale, John, is he hung out at Studio 54. Correct? That's one of the.
I believe
he was around Berkowitz.
Yeah, and he went to parties at Roy Cohn's place and various yachts and all sorts of stuff. Yeah, he saw probably more of the world that way than he would have been able to see otherwise. Perversely enough, yeah. For
sure, and that's a good point. Yeah, for sure, he was cultured. He was a cultured man, that David Berkowitz. But the I often wonder, and I just have some ridiculous thoughts in my brain hole here. David Berkowitz associated with Roy Cohn. Donald Trump knew Roy Cohn. Donald Trump's at Studio 54. David Berkowitz at Studio 54. Michael Jackson's at Studio 54 around the same time. Are Michael Jackson, David Berkowitz, and Donald Trump moonwalking their way around the dance floor of Studio 54 there in the mid to late 70s? Because it seems like they're all hanging out there together.
Yeah, I think it was and Andrew Crispo, the crazy art dealer, was there, and
that's the dude that Zeman edited out of the book, the new version of the digital version of the Ultimate Evil. He said, "No more Crispo." Yeah, so I mean, it's high society. Berkowitz is hobnobbing with.
It really was, yeah. I mean, he was he had, and I believe, accurate recollections of a lot of this stuff. Just like when Rainieri remembered, oh yeah, Jane Mansfield was at one of these sex parties that the cult had. I do think these are accurate recollections,
Sure.
because that's what these people get up to in their downtime. It's just that you go to crazy parties, and you're from Hollywood, or you're a musician, and you meet local people, and stuff just happens. So yeah.
Interesting. Strange culture, that drug culture. It does seem to make some odd bedfellows at times.
Yeah.
Especially within these Satanist kind of drug culture network. Not just New York City. The Ultimate Evil popped off in North Dakota as well. Part of the storyline there. So it's a transnational pipeline of this kind of satanic drug activity. John Carr specifically there in Minot, North Dakota. I've been to Minot. There's an Air Force base there, and I was a MP in the Air Force for many years. This is probably halfway through my career, so maybe around 2011 or so. I was up there from headquarters. We were opening up a new unit on the base there, but I'm in an environment where I should feel comfortable. I'm an Air Force base. I'm an Air Force MP. I shouldn't find this place to be a very peculiar spot. I'm like, that place is creepy as fuck, and
Really?
oh yeah. And I didn't want to be there 1 minute longer than I had to be there on like a 3-day trip. I think I had to go back there a second time for I only stayed like a day. And when I was watching, I mean, for what it is, that Sons of Sam documentary on Netflix, is an interesting, perspective to see how they're framing this kind of cover-up situation, as what I like to call the process church cover-upper movement. But there's some interesting details to discern from there as well. So I mean, I don't tell people to, just roll, don't just throw it out, without, checking it out. Yeah. Don't throw out the baby with the bathtub situation, but what Maury's producer friend that went up there and investigated some of Maury's claims there in the Ultimate Evil and verified these claims, as he speaks about in the documentary.
Yeah.
I laughed when he talked about how creepy it was there. I'm like, that dude ain't lying. It's a fucking creepy town.
It sounds interesting. I talked to Glenn Geetson just briefly a few years ago, the deputy who actually pulled John Carr up off the side of the road that time after he was pushed out of the van and his money was stolen. And, that marked the sort of the beginning of John's gradual breakdown, the last whatever year and a half of his life, 2 years, whatever it was. And he appeared just briefly in the Netflix documentary, but he said, the town was just lousy with occult activity. He said it was all over the place. He responded to various calls, across town, and that there was always something like that going on somewhere, he said. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was stationed in a very similar town in Montana, Great Falls, Montana. Not quite as creepy, but still kind of creepy. And looking back, I think I see a very similar environment. I was a very young man at the time. I was drinking every day. I was off work, so I really wasn't paying attention to these kind of details back then. But I did encounter while I was living there. I did come face to face with a cannibalistic child, diddling child murderer, who apparently was serving up human burgers there at the local Hardee's. A fellow by the name of Nathaniel Bar Jonah. He was arrested and later murdered in a Montana prison. But he was clearly part of a satanic pedophilic cult network while I was living there in Great Falls. So, I mean, again, very similar environment to Minot. The United States Air Force is basically the reason why both of these cities exist. If it weren't for the Air Force bases, that is the economy. So, very strange kind of correlations there between the two places. But yeah, Minot, super creepy. So you got to talk to the sheriff, huh? One of the deputies that investigated, huh?
Yeah. And he was a very nice man, very humble, willing to talk about it just, straight away. And he had, he said that there was consistent cult activity in and around Minot at the time. And from what you read in Maury's book, there definitely was something going on out there. I've always been curious exactly how the relationship was formed between the North Dakota cult and the Yonkers cult. It may have been directly.
That's a great question. I've wondered the same.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. I hate to interrupt you there. I know that's one of the things that I've long wondered. Like,
Yeah,
Again, I have
yeah,
some ideas, but I would like to hear. I'd like to hear your
yeah.
thoughts.
I would just assume that logically it had something to do with John Carr's drug connections,
Sure.
but it may have even gone back further than that. But I'd love to see somebody research that subject because it's ripe for research. A lot of work could be done on that, establishing the connection between Minot and Yonkers.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting you write a subsequent book to your Son of Sam. Though, but by all means, it sounds like you might be the perfect man for the mission. I think there would be an adequate study as the submerged history of the Minot, North Dakota cult.
Oh yeah, yeah. If I ever run across any information, I'd love to get into it because this is I live for this essentially now. It's central to everything I do. I am working on another book, and that may figure into it. At some point, if I can just kind of get my foot into the research door there. But I am
Nice.
working on something else, and hopefully I'll at least have a first draft ready in another 4 months or so. I'm shooting for.
Oh, that's
Can
awesome.
you give us a little sneak peek about what the second book is about?
Oh sure, yeah.
You beat me to it, Nate.
It's just more of the same, just in greater detail. Because people have asked me, well, what about this person or this event or whatever? So I'm just trying to cram it all in there, and it'll at least be like a couple of 100 pages, and maybe even more than that. So, the research is ongoing, so I'm just going to keep adding to it as I go, and it looks like it's going to turn into a pretty big book before it's finished. So I'll just
That's
ask
awesome.
people to bear with me because I'm a really slow worker, but I'm getting there.
Hey, no worries, John. You're welcome back anytime to discuss your future book as well, or more of these discussions.
Thank you, man.
I don't want to. I
I
appreciate your time tonight. I don't want to keep it too long here, and I'll definitely give you both you gents some closing thoughts. I figured we get things wrapped up here. We're about an hour and a half, but I just wanted to share with you my thoughts on Minot, North Dakota, and regarding the submerged history and how it may figure into the overall narrative. So, the city's known as the Magic City, so it almost has some occult, connotations to its name. It was founded by Stephen Minot or Minot. They're a prominent Brahmin class of Boston, the Boston blue blood families.
Mm-hmm.
One of them, they're out of Brookline, a wealthy suburb. They're very interrelated and intermarried with the Weld family. In fact, Tuesday Weld. Are you familiar with the actress Tuesday Weld? Is that a name either of you gents have ever heard of before?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So what as far as your understanding, John, is do you understand she's deeply ingrained in the occult activities of Hollywood and
I honestly didn't know that about her, but that gives me something else to research tomorrow because
okay.
I'm on top of this all the time. So that's a whole new area for me, but I look forward to finding out about it.
So Tuesday Weld, we talked about Jane Mansfield being present at Untermeyer Park rituals. So, and she was Anton LaVey dedicated his Satanic Bible to one of the individuals there was Jane Mansfield, who was a member of the Church of Satan.
Right.
Then another individual in that same dedication was Tuesday Weld. And in a 1972 book, Modern Day Witchcraft, maybe. I can send you the link later, John, and put it in the show notes. The name of the book's escaping me. But Anton LaVey's interviewed in this obscure book in the 70s, and he says the reason why he dedicated it to Tuesday Weld is because she's part of the rituals. So implying that she's deeply involved in occult activity. Other individuals would later peg her as being this quote-unquote Illuminati high priestess. Folks like Adam Go Rightly, an author who did an extensive coverage of the Manson family. And, in fact, I highly recommend his book, The Shadow over Santa Susanna, which he kind of picked up a lot of. I don't know if he ever met Ed Sanders. He definitely picked up a lot of the Sanders narrative from the family and ran with some of those, evolution of some of those ideas and concepts. Great book, great analysis. He would later write a book about, write some blogs about Tuesday Weld and some magazine articles, I believe. Anyhow, she seems very ingrained within this cult ritual network and whatnot. She's allegedly deeply tied to the whole Manson situation. But her great grandfather was Stephen Minot Weld, who would have been second cousins, I believe, with the fella who started Minot, North Dakota. So I'm just saying, well, amongst these kind of we talked about the quote unquote elite society of Westchester County. Mm-hmm. Well, if we want to talk about other elite societies, the Westchester County of Boston is these Boston Brahmins, the quote unquote blue bloods, these Brookline families like the Welds, like the Minots. And here we have an intersection of the Weld family, who has a lengthy history dating back to the Old World. They claim to be descendants from the ancient kings of Tara from Ireland. So they have a long occult history. Numerous publications citing this over the years. There's another. So you have this family who, again, is cousins with the guy who founded Minot, North Dakota. I don't think these subjects are that far off.
No, and there seems to be a similar pattern, like you said, lots of places with. I think, well, like in Yonkers, arguably the cult activity goes all the way back to the time of, what's his name? his name completely escapes me now. The guy who originally lived on the grounds
Samuel
of
Untermeyer.
Park were, but before
Samuel Tilden.
Tilden, yeah, the failed presidential candidate. Yeah,
yeah. Well, technically he won. Technically he won. It was the Great Compromise of 1877. But yeah.
I just completely blanked on his name there. But I would argue that even in his day, there were some odd things going on. I've run across one or two vague newspaper headlines that made it sound like some odd things were happening in the vicinity of his property. But yeah,
that's a good point. That's a good point, and perhaps grounds for future conversation. Because one thing I'm deeply interested in is the mounds, these ancient architectural and ritual sites of America, and that property as a mound site property. So that's a good point you bring up, John. We talk about the 1920s. This shit goes back even further. It seems like.
Oh yeah.
No, Tilden's an interesting character. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to read more about him. Somewhere I have bookmarked or screenshotted a couple of those headlines that I was referring to just a minute ago. But there were things that they were just odd enough that you think, all the way back then, something is already happening on this property that's not wholesome, but
right.
Yeah, it got
some nefarious shit. You got some nefarious shit popping off there.
Yeah.
And again, Untermeyer deeply politically connected. His I'm not Untermeyer, Tilden. His mentor was Martin Van Buren, President Martin Van Buren. He was part of the Tammany Hall network, and his father, Tilden's father, he's a carpetbagger. They were involved in financing they were involved in the Confederate operations. Untermeyer, I believe his father was involved in financing the Confederacy. So a lot of these weird Southern influences there within that Westchester, Untermeyer Park, Tilden estate situation.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just, this part I'll make really brief, but in the town where I grew up in Northwest Alabama, there was a group of occultists, and I never knew exactly how serious they were because I never interacted with them, but they met on the grounds of an old burned out plantation home out in the country. The home itself had burned down, but these brick columns all around the porch had survived, and they met and did rituals every Friday night. In fact, I was invited at one point by a girl who was years younger than me. But this stuff was
how old were you? How old were you when this happened?
I was about 16 the first time I heard about it.
Okay.
But she said that they used copies of the Necronomicon and that they would try to conjure demons from this. By the mid-90s, they were hanging from the trees out there these little, they were like mobiles that you hang over a baby's crib, but they were made out of like pieces of stained glass, and they had occult symbols etched into them, and they were hanging from the trees out in the country. And a newspaper photographer actually went out there and photographed a couple of them. And so I had something even locally like this going on, and I knew at least a couple of people who were involved to different extents. The girl who invited me was sort of a casual participant.
There
was a guy,
she was a recruiter, huh?
And the guy was an acid head. He was really seriously into it, and he gradually started to have sort of a John Carr type breakdown. So yeah, this stuff it has taken root in a lot of places.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I encountered a homicidal vampire cult in rural Kentucky when I was 17. So this stuff it's spread long and far, even in the Bible Belt states like Alabama and Murray, Kentucky.
Yes, absolutely. And Kentucky it's pretty. Some of the remote areas there are pretty creepy. Arkansas too. Arkansas is another place.
Arkansas, yeah.
Well,
you got the West Memphis 3 situation there. That was a good Good example
Yeah.
of that
Yeah.
some Crowleyism going on there in Arkansas, huh?
Yeah.
Some 8-year-old boys. I think that was his favorite, Crowley's, for magical rituals and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people still, they don't realize how perverse this stuff actually was. I mean, anybody who doubts that Crowley, I mean, if they think he was just this harmless crank or eccentric or whatever, they should read about him to see just how disgusting he and his practices really were.
Yeah, no limits to the debauchery, that's for sure.
No.
Especially in the island of
circle back
Thelema.
to where. Oh, sorry, man.
No, Nate, go ahead. Knock it out.
I was going to say to
Jonathan, do you got any more closing thoughts for us before we let Nate hit us with some closing thoughts?
Oh, well, I was just going to bring up something real. I'm sorry to touch on so many different tentacles of this. It's a wide-ranging case, but the one thing I think is interesting that I haven't discussed very much publicly, although I do devote about a chapter's worth of stuff to it in the book toward the end, is the appearance of numerous references to the Yonkers case in the writing of Peter Straub, the late horror novelist. In fact, I'm rereading one of Straub's books right now, Mr. X. And he co-wrote a couple of books with Stephen King, and that's primarily what he's known for now. But
it's not a good credit to have these days, I don't think.
It's really there's been a lot of crap from him about the past 30 years.
Right.
I just prefer the old stuff. But yes, Straub was Straub wrote like really intelligent, very like overtly literate horror, so that sort of fell out of favor after a while. But he wrote a novel.
He's a Lovecraftian.
Yeah, he was more, but he wrote a novel in 1979 called Ghost Story. It was always one of my favorite books, and I would reread it every Halloween or sometime around there. But in 1996, after I had read Maury's book for the first time, I thought, geez, a lot of this sounds very similar to some of the allegedly fictional details in Ghost Story. So finally, what I did about 4 years ago is just take a piece of paper, write down everything I could find in The Ultimate Evil that seemed to have a quote-unquote fictional correspondence in Ghost Story. And there were at least 36 references to the cult, specifically to the Yonkers cult and its activities, just in the text of that one book.
Holy smokes.
Yeah, other details appear in other novels, but that's the main one.
That's wild.
Yeah,
I've never heard of this guy, but this is you're blowing my mind hole here, John.
It's very. I jumped out of my chair 4 years ago. I realized it. I just could not. I mean, I always felt that a lot of the novel felt kind of disturbingly real. Like it was based on real people or events. But I never knew. I just didn't. You just don't assume that something like that is the case, But by 1990,
well, it takes place in Milburn, huh?
Milburn, yeah, which is he sets it in upstate New York, but it's not
that far away, right?
Yonkers. Once you start to read about it, that it's just the parallels are just inescapable, And he has made reference at times even to the actual names of people involved in this case, even to the point of, we had the Maurice Flipper list up earlier, and we briefly scrolled past the name of Ron Spachala, who was involved with the planning, allegedly, of the Son of Sam murders. He was a convicted child molester, was dishonorably discharged from the Navy. Spachala was in no way, through the midst of any of this, a public figure, and his name was not publicly known, as far as I know. But in 1990, Peter Straub names an incidental character in one of his novels, Mystery, Officer Spachala. He's a
really
uniform. Yeah, so it's an oddly specific name to use. It's not like Smith or Jones that he turns up this name Spachala, but you find references to the case all throughout his work, and it's really fascinating because Peter Straub's novels are like a completely separate confirmation of Maury's research, because as far as we know, they never met, never spoke to each other. They may have, but I can't find any indication that they did. So the fact that Straub knew about all this stuff and was putting it as fiction in his novels as early as the late 70s seems to indicate a whole other separate confirmation that the details of Maury's case are accurate. So
Yeah.
even for the folks that don't enjoy Straub as a storyteller, I would ask them to just sort through some of his books and see how many references jump off the page at you, because it becomes almost alarming after a while. But it's interesting to read him either way.
No, for sure. I mean, everything you're saying to me right now is bringing up a lot of different ideas, and so I'll definitely share some with you offline. I've tracked some process church activities in and around Millburn, including the epicenter of activity with pornography, rock and roll, and the mafia.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to get more into that.
No, it's just interesting that would take place, because it's not that far. I mean, it's essentially just across. It's the Hudson River Valley. It's across the Hudson River, but I mean, these two, Millburn and Yonkers, are geographically in the same region. I mean, it's 66 miles.
Well, he brings up. It's just so it's hard to know where to begin. He starts by setting the prologue and the epilogue of the novel in Panama City, Florida, which is where John Carr was stationed in the late 60s and early 70s.
Right.
And from there, the references just pile up one after another. But it really grabbed me the first time I realized what he was actually talking about in the story. But it makes it
fascinating
read. Yeah.
That's fascinating literary analysis you've done there, John. I certainly will invite you back here once to discuss that anytime.
Well, thank you.
I don't want to move past this Spicella fellow because I know he's important. I know you've already brought up a few of those details. I'm scrolling through this list again. I don't see him. I can't. I'm sure I'm just missing it. Can
Spicella, yeah.
Can you hit? Because not only is it a weird name, like he was an interesting character in the cult too. There, right?
Yeah, he was one of the people that Berkowitz recalled was at the planning meeting in April of 1976 to plan out the Son of Sam attacks. And Berkowitz said, of course, Mr. Real Estate was there because it was either his house or a property that he owned or was associated with. That was probably James Donovan.
Right.
So, Berkowitz was there. Richie Sperrazza.
I tend to think it might be his wife, Mrs. Real Estate. But
she could have had more to do with it. Yeah, because it's really hard to nail down details on that particular family. They've covered their tracks pretty well.
Yeah, and the process's pope, their literal pope, as they call it in their incorporation documents, is a female. So that was Mary Ann Grimston for many years.
Right.
There's been apparently a number of power offshoots, power control, little wars amongst the different females in that cult. But it does seem to be a female-led cult, so I tend to think Mrs. Real Estate. But yeah, I mean, so you're saying that the Spicella guy was there in the mix with the planning at the homes of the Mr. and Mrs. Real Estate.
Right. Berkowitz says he recalls him being there. Yeah.
So it's not even just it is a unique name, but it would be a unique character to include if you're making this pattern of elements from the cult into this science fiction novel, right?
Right, and particularly
he would be a character you would want to focus on.
Right. Yeah. It was long before anybody really knew the name Spicella, which has really just emerged for our community just in the past few years. So
sure.
It's eerie that Straub seems to have already known about some of this stuff. Even long before Maury wrote The Ultimate Evil, Straub seems to have had a pretty detailed source who gave him this information, and he decided to disguise it as fiction. And he did it very well. He was a brilliant writer. But it was by no means was all of it fiction. A lot of what he was writing about was thinly veiled fact.
Yeah. This is all very fascinating to me because, especially in this literary analysis you're providing, this is a common tactic amongst intelligence operatives. In fact, many of the men that founded the OSS and the CIA both, these weren't men of spycraft. These were men of literature.
Yes.
These guys were literary majors and writers. In fact, a number of them, come to mind. One of them that comes to mind, not an OSS or CIA guy, but the guy who wrote the Army's during World War II. He wrote the Army Technical Manual on Psychological Warfare. He'd be like a pre-Aquino. He'd be like the Aquino. Before him, you have Lansdale. Before Lansdale, you have this guy. Right. His name's escaping me, but he was a science fiction author, and he wrote under the name Cordwainer Smith.
Yes. Well, funnily enough, Straub, this is a detail I'd forgotten, but I'm so glad you brought that up. In this book, Mr. X, the villain's name is Cordwainer. So Straub, he was always dropping a lot of breadcrumbs in every book he wrote. Yeah. Yeah. I know the guy.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So, because Cordwainer's, he was an Army captain. He was L. Ron Hubbard's college roommate. Much of the details of L. Ron Hubbard's biography that he claimed he actually stole from his college roommates, Paul Linebarger. Yeah. And he would be a guy you would include in the character in a science fiction novel like that by calling him Corbin or referencing him that, because this guy, like I said, he had a Quino in psychological warfare before he even like Lansdale. Before that, you had Paul Linebarger. So, for example, he would later make comments about witnessing the events of the JFK assassination, saying that he witnessed his tactics being employed at Dealey Plaza that day. What he meant by that is, didn't really qualify, but obviously, he actually, one of his students would have been E. Howard Hunt. That would have been somebody that Paul Linebarger would have trained in psychological warfare. So, there is a lot to be said about these characters, but for whatever reason, they embed stuff in sci-fi novels. Corbin or Smith, Paul Linebarger wrote a sci-fi novel where if you take the first letter of each line in the first page, it says like Oswald never fired a shot. He embeds these messages in the science fiction. And that's just one example, but there's numerous other examples such as that, from Anthony Burgess to even folks like, not necessarily science fiction, but again OSS CIA guys, Lauren Singer, who wrote a film called The Parallax Effect starring Warren Beatty, which involves this mind control team of assassins going around murdering folks like the president of France, and it's very very spooky activity, but again, it's a spook writing it. So there is this weird confluence of events with these sci-fi novels. You bring up some interesting concepts there, John, for sure. Right. You got my wheels turning.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm glad to pass the information along, because it's I know it's a lot for people to wrap their heads around, that they think, well, geez, would an author of fiction really be involved with that sort of stuff? And the book is Mr. X. It's just a great novel on its own terms. Like, even if you don't, research any of the strangeness behind the story, but it's a really great book. I recommend all of Straub's stuff. And he kind of, the final confirmation for me that he was involved in this on some level was the fact that he dedicated Ghost Story to two psychotherapists who were associated with Tavistock and R.D. Laing. I mean, that's how specific it gets. There on the dedication page, he named his daughter after the female psychotherapist. So that's pretty odd.
That's too on the nose. John. It wasn't Eric Trist, was it? Was it Eric Trist?
No, but Eric Trist is the guy that I regard as the great granddaddy of all this horrible stuff that we're talking about.
Oh, for sure.
He came up with the social turbulence theory, which is exactly the same thing that the process peddled later. And he proposed it at first in the year that the process started as compulsions analysis in 1963. So, yeah.
You're spot on target, John. And when he left Tavistock, he went over to UCLA and worked with Louis Jellian West for a brief stint. And again, and his son, Alan, is the president, and I believe he's still alive. He's the president of the Grateful Dead's music publishing company, because he was best friends with Jerry Garcia.
Oh, man. Well, like you said, it's so on the nose. It's almost painful.
It is painful. It's very painful when this dude's dedicating his sci-fi novel to Tavistock. It's crazy. No, John, I appreciate these. I mean, you just dropped some. So again, you got my wheels turning here. I appreciate the time you spent here sharing all this information with us tonight, and I definitely invite you back here anytime. And Nate, I apologize for interrupting you there. I know you got some closing thoughts, and turning it back over here to you. To appreciate you joining us here tonight too, filling in as a co-host here for Nick's absence, and definitely welcome back anytime for future Fridays here, Nate. Anytime. But yeah, what are your thoughts? You got some parting statements and thoughts for us here? You're on mute.
I actually don't have any closing thoughts. I don't remember what I was going to say, but it was some question about David Berkowitz, anyways. Okay. But thank you. I appreciate you having me on, brother. I love coming on here. I love Nick, so I hope Nick feels better. Sure. Jonathan, this was fantastic, man. This was super interesting. There's so much to dig into here. And I mean, you are kind of speaking my language with all of these different connections here with these cults and the CIA, the MK Ultra, and all, like, honestly, like the entire hippie movement in general, and a lot of this music scene, all of this is so tied together. And so like, I appreciate you making some of these connections and just feeding people's interest in this, because I think there's way more to dig into here. And yeah, David Berkowitz was an weird, basically, like, the way I see it at this point is David Berkowitz was kind of a fall guy. He was the scapegoat, and they just kind of let him like eat up all of those different those murders. And maybe he was guilty for some of them, and it doesn't seem like he was guilty for all of them. And I think it is interesting that they allow somebody to kind of get famous. He's a famous serial killer, and maybe they just, a lot of times, some of these secret societies and different things like that, I think they, it's kind of like saying Kobe, before you throw a piece of paper in the trash can. I think they like to put their signs and symbols on different things, but they quietly do it. So they kind of take credit for things, but not really. And they let people like David Berkowitz kind of eat the time, as it would be,
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah, that's an accurate analysis. I agree too there, Nate. I have a parting question for you there, Nate, in regards to your father's connections to Charles Manson. You mentioned he ran around with the since he's Mexican fellow, he ran around with his native Mexican crowd there in the Los Angeles region. So did he know actor Danny Trejo?
I don't actually know that. That's a great question. I wish he
Danny
did.
Trejo knew Charles Manson.
I should probably reach out to Danny Trejo at some point. That would be kind of fun. I would love to have him on the show.
Yeah. Well, they're both Mexican fellas in Los Angeles who knew Charles Manson. I mean, what are the odds? I mean, they're running in the same circles, right? I mean, maybe
no doubt,
father knew Danny Trejo, dude. Now, I appreciate you gents' time, and hope it looks like as per the chat, a lot of folks of the interwebs here enjoyed the conversation. Like I said, anytime y'all want to come back, John, I look forward to this literary analysis of your sci-fi work and your future Son of Sam research. Like I said, send you a few notes offline regarding some of the stuff we talked about. And welcome back anytime, Nate. Great. Welcome back anytime, sir. Appreciate your time. And that's it. We'll call the end of the show here.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
Well, that's it. That's the show here, folks. So the next time you're out on the town, visiting your local watering holes, or perhaps just meandering around, and you hear the unmistakable sounds of metal clanking, and you spot signs of a disturbance, but check your six. Look in that garbage can, 'cause you never can tell. The GCDs may be loose in your town.